to welcome you to the Clinical AI interest group, linked to the Alan Turing Institute this afternoon. And we've been joined by Geoffrey Hogg. Nick, I think, is going to introduce him in a minute. But before we get started, just a couple of things to flag for our members, existing or new. If you've joined us, very, very warm welcome to you. We tend to meet monthly. Our next meeting is actually on the 2nd of December, not the 2nd, not the other Tuesday. So the 2nd of December at 12 o'clock, usual time, where we'll be hearing from the NHS Clinical AI Fellows, past participants, hearing about their reflections and the added value of that programme to them in their careers. I think it'll be a really great one, a nice one to warm up for Christmas. And another date for your diary coming up sooner is the 26th of November, where the AI for Women's Health meeting is going ahead with a couple of speakers. Gian Hurst from Imperial, talking about AI and digital solutions to close the last mile care gaps for women in lower middle income countries, and George Partridge from Kayasco Research, talking about takeaways of WIS 2025, so delivering the future of health for women, and you're more than welcome to join that one. As Nick mentioned, I'm not sure if some of you maybe joined a wee bit later, we record these sessions, so then they're up on YouTube and you can look back at past ones as well too, and view them at your leisure, and feel free to share as well too. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nick, I think, to start with. Nick.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Alicia. And so as part of these meetings, because we're now quite a large group, it's nice to break down the community and hear a bit from individuals within the membership. And so today, for our 3-minute intro, and I hope that you're doing a kind of drum roll on your desks at home, we have Thomas Wood from Fast Data Science. Thomas, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, thanks very much for the intro. So I have a small consulting company which works on natural language processing solutions for healthcare and pharma. We do a lot of kind of consulting work for, let's say, different companies in the healthcare space, and we're also working on models which read clinical trial documents like protocols. So, I mean, a brief, am I allowed to share screen to just briefly show that? So this is basically what we've been putting together, is a system where you can drag and drop a PDF of a trial protocol into our system. It finds the protocol title and then calculates a risk score based on the trial design. So does the trial have a sample size that's too small, or inclusion and exclusion criteria which were unrealistic, and then you get a load of kind of strengths and weaknesses. And then also what we're now working on is kind of this budgeting. So the idea that it pulls out the list of activities in a trial and then finds the costs. So we're hoping, so the first part of it is open source, and we worked with the Gates Foundation to get it out there. And now we're looking to work with an American cancer center called MSK. So hopefully they'll take it a bit further. So that's what one of the things we're working on, and the others are kind of consulting around things like EHRs and so on. Thanks very much.
Thomas, that's amazing. Would you how did you go about developing the models for this?
So they're all kind of a mixture of whatever works. So we started this about 5 years ago. So before Gen AI was an option, and also we're just banned from using it anywhere. So it was things like naive Bayes classifiers, really simple things like that. Finding whatever we can on clinicaltrials.gov. It's been quite hard to find anything that's commercially sensitive, but luckily when you're working with protocols, there's huge amounts of data that's out there that's public. Once you're dealing with patient data, then that's much harder to, you have a barrier. You can only get your foot in the door when you're working with a company that will give you that data and sign all the NDAs and so on. But luckily because all countries that run clinical trials have a registry, and the WHO has their registry of registries. So there's UK trials all registered somewhere, and all of them have the protocol. So there's a huge kind of wealth, like a treasure trove of data that's available to train models. And when people upload a trial, they also tag things like the sample size and what kind of document it is. So there's a huge amount of both unstructured and structured data which you can use to train things. And then recently we started putting OpenAI in for the stage of kind of pulling out the tables. There's a lot of tables in the PDFs which are very hard. So you need, we found we couldn't do that without OpenAI. So that was a blocker there.
Brilliant. So fascinating. Well, a very warm round of applause. Clinical AI round of applause. And thank you so much, Thomas, for sharing.
Thanks so much.
I'm now going to hand over to Joe.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Thomas. So hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to introduce and be hosting now the next and main session of today's meeting. My friend and colleague, Dr. Jeffrey Hogg, assistant professor at the University of Birmingham, will be talking about a project that him and the team have been working on there. I guess just to signpost how the rest of the afternoon's going to work. So we'll have a presentation from Jeff and an opportunity for question and answer at the end. So if you do have any burning questions, jot them in the chat as you go. And then once Jeff has finished the presentation, we'll come to those as a Q&A. And then I'll be handing over to Emma just to round us off towards the end of the session to give you details of next meetings and how to connect with us as a community. So Jeff, great pleasure to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed, Joe. That's brilliant. And thanks for having me. It's lovely to be here. I have a presentation about a project that's very much at the right-hand side of the translational pathway for AI and health and care services. Delivered with Joe and other colleagues in Birmingham and a network from different organisations across the country that I'll introduce you to as we go along. My role is a little bit in the education and research and practice space in AI implementation. So we've set up an MSc in AI implementation this year, which has been very exciting in the university. I have some role in the governance teams around AI in the hospital trust there, and then get to do a bit of research like this in that kind of translational space around implementation. So this project is funded by NHS England and the Health Foundation, and it targets leaders of health and care provider organisations, which is attempted to be summed up by this image here. So they're under a lot of pressure and there's a lot of excitement around AI to bring in new shiny solutions that are kind of thrust in their direction. The difficulty is that sometimes these solutions aren't all they appear to be. And if you look more closely at this GAI generated image, it was a really good fit. I was pleased when it popped up and I could put it in my slide, but then I noticed that excellence not spelled like that. And that graph doesn't actually make any sense. So it's trying to equip people to basically know the kind of risks that they're taking on in their organization, but also know the benefits more truly as well. We're not trying to be big pessimists here, but it's a bit of a crutch for these people trying to make these decisions. So moving on, the kind of problem that we're trying to address is that from our contacts across the ecosystem in different health and care provider organizations, there's a lot of a sense from leaders and others in these organizations that they may not be ready for AI yet, but also that it's not quite clear what it is that would make them feel that way. And that's a problem that these senior risk owners experience, but it's a problem that trickles down to lots of other stakeholders across the ecosystem. And the reason it's a problem is because patients and services can come to harm through either over-enthusiastic adoption of AI, but also over-reticence. A failure to innovate and see the benefits of an innovation can be just as harmful. And so the goal of this was really not to generate new knowledge, but to consolidate and make accessible good practices that are out there. And create a kind of checklist that structures the thinking of these leaders in different organizations that have to manage all sorts of different things to be able to more accurately know the risk they're taking on and the benefits they can expect to receive as they prioritize AI against other solutions that they have to decide where to put investment in. And we've been on a bit of a journey, which will be the structure of most of this talk. And it started off with some desk research and looking for good practice around AI governance and implementation from all sorts of different literature and local documents. We also, in Birmingham, we host a Centre of Excellence for Regulatory Science and Innovation in AI, and so very lucky to be connected to some parts of the ecosystem. We're able to speak with trailblazers in different institutions who have successfully led AI implementation efforts, but also domain experts in cybersecurity, information governance, procurement, and other aspects. That helped us kind of distill down some ideas of the direction we thought we wanted to go and what this checklist might look like. And as I'll touch on in a minute, that was definitely a learning journey. But we wanted to make sure that it wasn't just us in a room and the people that we'd spoken to. So we put that out to a kind of validation survey through a few different channels, like the AI Ambassadors Forum you might have heard of, and the Responsible AI Network and others, to basically see if people thought we were heading in the right direction. And broadly they did, helping us to tweak things. And then we went a step further to do a workshop to look at different aspects in a bit more depth and iterate. We've then kind of prototyped an outtool on the basis of what we've heard, which I'll be able to point to a little bit today. And now we're moving into a kind of piloting phase. So we've done some things similar to this kind of talk on a larger scale. And if I may, I've got a sneaky Slido poll, which is quite brief towards the end to try and garner your opinion and help us move in the right direction. And then we're also going to be having kind of more focused piloting sessions with leaders in different organizations. And we're slowly getting some output. I'll, towards the end, let you see what we've got planned for the next few months. And then it's about bringing it into practice, basically. So starting off at the beginning with the desk research. So we did look in academic literature, but we also looked at different policies and sort of standard operating procedures around AI implementation from trusts or other provider organizations. And trying to kind of pick out the elements of what good looks like. The other thing that we realized on this journey, and we knew beforehand, but it really just kind of cemented it, was that it's a bit of a brownfield site, this, and there's lots of kind of competing and good overlapping initiatives that is important to understand the complementarity and overlap between. A really good example of that, many of you may be familiar with the digital maturity assessment, which is a kind of test, if you like, but it's really a scoring system that every chief information officer of a provider organization needs to fill out each year, and it assigns them a score or a level of how digitally mature they are against this what good looks like framework. And that score has a range of different purposes and applications. So it was kind of having to see where the value of those things were and where the value that we might offer and add in the AI space. Then with these interviews, we ended up speaking with, I think it was about 20, perhaps 21 different individuals all in all. And again, exploring this idea of what AI readiness was and what good practice for AI implementation and use looked like and what the requirements of that were. So an example of some of the kind of things that came up, both in this step and the prior one, were these kind of AI governance teams or AI oversight groups within an organization. There's a nice figure lifted here from a paper from Susie Shelmerdine and colleagues, giving you a flavor of the kind of skills or individuals that are in those groups and the purposes they solve. We also tried to get some of the kind of depth of expertise required in some of these spaces, not just AI general. So we're speaking with NHSE specialists, for instance, in clinical safety, information governance, technical assurance, and cyber, and also on the industry side, which was great. Just having those conversations, to be honest, was a really enjoyable process. And then we were pulling that all together, and there's a few kind of insights that tripped out of it. One is that AI exceptionalism is not going to be our friend here. So we can think of AI as a kind of pinnacle innovation, if you like, that rests upon various other things. But at the end of the day, it's dependent on lots of things like workforce governance, estates, etc. in this figure, that other innovations are. And it's dependent on many of the same things that digital transformation is as well. It does present some distinctions, which require some consideration. But it's important that we don't kid ourselves that it's completely unique, and that AI brings new challenges that have never been seen before. It's more about the kind of constellation of different things. The other thing is that there's a huge source of variety, increasingly so. I'm just thinking of AI as a similar entity as everybody on this group will know. It is probably a bit of a reductionist approach, but it's not just the technology that makes it different. It's quite a lot of different things about the way it's used, where the training data came from, how often it's been used before in the NHS, how complex the target pathway is. Is it just a point solution, or is it something that's enterprise-wide? So when an adopter is thinking about just how much of a challenge this AI solution is going to present, there's quite a lot of different factors they might have to think through. And it's important that we don't pretend that it's just one size fits all, which was very much our hope that we might offer something simple and very actionable at the outset. But going along the way, we came to terms with the fact that that wouldn't really be possible. That meant that we kind of went up a bit on the scale of abstraction, if you like, trying to talk in more generalizable terms and be more relevant to different kind of settings. And what we found as we did that is that, one, having more conversations across the ecosystem, this was a need that was felt widely in different types of provider organization. And two, that the kind of solution that we were shaping up, because it was more generalizable and a bit more abstract, did have a wider scope of relevance. Most of our team comes from a secondary care background, and so our focus has always been there. But fortunately, over the course of the project, we've been able not only to speak to, but be joined on the team, the project team, by primary care doctors and dentists and healthcare specialists as well, which has allowed us to get a bit more of an authentic insight. And is something that we're working at in this piloting stage as well. And also across all 4 nations, not just thinking of NHS England, even though that's the funder. The other thing is, as we've found all of these examples of good practice in one trust or one provider that hadn't been shared, it was clear first that we didn't need to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of good practice out there to shine a light on, but also that this wasn't going to work to just sort of say this is how it must be done and prescribe that to adopter organizations. So we heard that one of the key motives for different adopters would simply be managing the risks that they own. And so the framing of the tool kind of lent towards that, to help people think through the potential harms that could come from bringing AI on, which would ultimately be their responsibility. And rather than just leaving them in that negative place, showcase some potential solutions as well, and that their incentivization to take them up, if you like, would be through knowing the risks better. So this is definitely a brownfield site, and we had a good long think about how it was we could be useful in that space. And what this project really aims to do is to consolidate existing work. So I would be super grateful either through Q&A or dropping in the chat as we go along, and you get more of a sense of what we're shooting at here. If you think of examples of, oh, this is great practice, you must include this, or show some examples of that, please do share or email or whatever works. Also, some degree of quality assurance or central endorsement, because there are a lot of recommendations or approaches you could take, and it's quite hard if it's an unfamiliar field to know which ones to go with. And we're also trying to tackle this kind of flexibility, being relevant to different AI technology types, being relevant to different provider organization types, and trying to improve accessibility from all of those different provider organizations as well. Because very similar problems are experienced across the ecosystem. It'd be really nice to share learning across the ecosystem as well and avoid too much duplication. So for the kind of solution, if you like, or checklist tool, we wanted to make it very familiar. So we based it around a standard risk framework from NHS providers, which breaks risk down into clinical, operational, workforce, financial, and external risk, hoping that the potential users would feel that it was spoken in a familiar language. And then on the kind of managing the risk side of things, we used maturity model from academic literature. It's actually a preprint. But in the same way, there's a whole literature around maturity models as a concept. And there's an even greater amount of unpublished work around maturity models because it's a big part of the kind of guidance of management consultants and that kind of thing. So this paper was a systematic review that brought together maturity models from AI and healthcare specifically. And it had some kind of domains or categories, if you like, that we could house the solutions to clinical leaders in. And so this schema tries to put up the bare bones of what the AI readiness checklist looks like. So for the user in a health or care provider organization, they're thinking about their specific place and a specific technology. So it's their job to kind of go down the scale of abstraction, if you like. And they've got this framework to work through. And first, they go through a range of different high-level potential causes of harm in these clinical, operational, workforce, financial, and external categories. And then, as I say, rather than just leaving people with a sort of ominous sense of foreboding, we highlight the controls that an organization might have in place already for them to look through and think, oh yeah, we do have that. But also to highlight the things that could be in place that aren't already. So if they feel like actually having looked down those potential causes of harm, some of them make them feel a bit uncomfortable and they want to do more about it, and there's a kind of menu there to try and bring themselves to a state of readiness if they don't already feel they are. And the way we try and balance this need to be at a high level of abstraction whilst actually being actionable and not too sort of fluffy is that under all of these particular causes or controls, and there's about 20 of each listed out under these categories, we are developing a kind of library of actual examples of those controls. So that might be, here's a template DPIA for AI from the Information Commissioner's Office, or here's the terms of reference for an AI oversight group that Trust X used that you could develop for your own trust. And so that's the idea of how to manage that tension between being useful but being generalizable. So just to give you an example underneath the hood of that schema, as I say, there's about 20 sort of top level causes of harm listed in those 5 categories. And here's an example for the clinical causes. So one is unanticipated secondary effects. So example of this, if we think of a CT head analysis tool that tries to identify strokes that need thrombectomy, it could be that there's a result of that is that more thrombectomy takes place, which puts higher demands on ITU beds within a service and pushes capacity or pushes demand above capacity. And as a result, people that need ITU beds don't get it, and there could be negative consequences for patients because of that. Underperformance in the local context, you could think of AI scribes, for instance, that have certain performance metrics when tested in other areas, but when deployed in your institution, maybe because of background noise in the setting it's deployed or local accent or something like that, the performance isn't as high as you think, and maybe it leads to reputational harm because there's errors on letters that go out to patients or something like that. Underperformance for population subgroup. So this could not necessarily be in a subgroup you'd anticipated. For example, for retina scanning AI, it may be that it performs less well in very myopic patients, for instance, and you only notice this after deployment, and it wasn't in the kind of data that you were making a decision on. And then reduction in performance over time is another example. It makes me think of case reports I've seen of chest X-ray reporting AI software where software somewhere in the stack, just in the PAC system, was updated. And actually that led to a sudden step down in performance over time, even though it was very good in the first instance. So that's an example of the kind of things that can be described there. And I won't go into too much detail on these ones, but this is an example of the organizational structure controls. So one of those categories of controls that can be put in place for harms. So one is that single oversight group, which we saw that figure of, that kind of has IG, procurement, clinical safety expertise all sat around a table. gatekeeping where investments go, how things are prioritized, task and finish groups, which are based around a single project to kind of see it through and make sure it happens. Being connected outside of the provider organization is really valuable. So communities of practice like this are fantastic. Having a good relationship between the vendor of a product and the adopter. For things like post-market surveillance, it's really difficult to do that just on one side of the fence, for instance. Having a clear strategy around public engagement and some input from ethics as well, and the governance processes that's formalized. And then having sort of standard operating procedures or documentation that means that everybody knows how the process of AI implementation runs in that place and who the kind of next step is along the process and where the responsibility lies, so things don't get stalled. So then we did this survey, as mentioned, basically to try and refine some of those ideas. And we distributed it through a number of different networks, as mentioned. And all in all, we got 52. This was not a trivial survey. It was probably about an hour of time. And this gives you a sense of the kind of spread of people who were many-hatted, hence the primary job role and secondary occupation, but across a range of different disciplines, crucially, to cover all those different domains. And then that helped us make a few tweaks ahead of a workshop hosted at the Welcome. There's a picture of everybody. And if you think back to that figure where there were so many different categories of causes of harm, we essentially stacked tables for breakout groups with expertise in clinical risk, for instance, or operational risk or financial risk. And each of those tables kind of focused on that particular domain to refine it and challenge it and reiterate it. And we also, on that day, explored what would be the best vehicle to try and actually implement this, and what would be useful to leaders in health and care provider organizations. And these are some of the posters we put up to try and give a sense of it, but we were mooting the idea of a relatively inert policy document that sort of just explains it through, an interactive web tool, maturity models, coming back to that idea of digital maturity assessment, and then also this very quantitative sort of risk matrix where you give yourself a number for what risks are worst. And don't worry, I don't for a moment intend you to read any of that, just to give you a sense of how we shared it on the day. And so off the back of that, we were able to refine what was actually going into the output. And also think a bit about the language of how because in risk management, all of these terms have quite specific meaning, and not all of the users are going to be from that community, but we want to make sure that we're kind of respecting established definitions of these terms. And it gave us a steer to head towards that interactive tool approach for an output. Gave us a sense of what kind of provider organizations we should try and engage in the piloting steps and where from. So that was really valuable. And coming out of that are outputs that we're kind of working towards over the next year, some sooner than others. Imminently, we're hoping to get a green paper out on the 30 AI website, which is essentially the policy document version of this in draft to lay out the ideas and those causes of harm and potential controls. We also have a prototype web tool to go with that, which you'll be able to see today, actually. But we're hoping to embed it in a sort of central place. Perhaps, I don't know if anybody's seen the ADA's website, but that kind of destination hosted by either NHS England or Department of Health. Because one of the things we've been hearing about is really important that it's seen as a kind of central source. We'll also be sharing the process as an academic output just for kind of transparency. And we've recently started working with a colleague, Taf Ahmed, who was based in the CQC last year, who's been thinking about AI scribes in primary care, the kind of patterns of use at the moment, and how to move forward from the CQC's perspective. And we're hoping to have some kind of output there so that there's, I guess, some connection to how provider organizations are regulated, as well as a kind of guideline. So next, I'm just going to give you a quick whistle-stop tour of this web tool. The QR code and link there is something, it's not a clickable link, of course, I'm afraid, but hopefully relatively simple. Depending on where you are, might land you the wrong side of a firewall, I'm afraid, but don't worry, I've got some screen grabs coming up on the next slides if that's the case. Essentially, you just land on a web page. The requests for data there are not active. It's just to kind of show you what the interface would look like. So please don't feel any need whatsoever to put anything in. But it gives you a sense of what the tool's about. Then there's a kind of dashboard to help people pace themselves and to orientate themselves through the process. Then each of those kind of 20 potential causes of harm are served up like this, with links to explanations or examples as well, for the user to think about whether or not that's relevant to the particular AI technology they're considering in their organization. And they can say it's not, can say it is, or can say they're not sure. And then of those kind of controls, so the different kind of interventions an organization can make to manage these risks, there's a kind of clickable menu, so the user can say, yeah, we got that one, yeah, we got that one, yeah, we got that one, and they can put a bit of detail in on a drop down there. And it also kind of remembers the ones that haven't been clicked, if you like. And then that's all pulled together in this readiness report at the end, which essentially lists, it feeds back the kind of controls that are in place already, and then suggests some next steps of controls that could be put in place to improve their ability to manage some of those risks, basically. And so that places us at this piloting point now, really, as I say. And just into next year, we'll move into some kind of focus group type approaches with health and care leaders to see how the tool lands and how it works on the ground. But for the moment, we've been doing some kind of polling and surveying, which is a little segue for me to ask if you'd either go to cider.com or use this QR code, and I'll switch so you can see the answers as they come in. It's only 4 questions, so I think we'll be done in under 5 minutes, if that's okay. And then I'll wrap up and just take some questions from the floor, if that's okay. I haven't managed to integrate the Slido bit, so hopefully whilst you're loading on, logging into that page, I can do a bit of a switcheroo to get us to the right one. Thanks, I can see people are already answering. That's great. So this is just to give us a little bit of context for what kind of voices are coming into this and hear what you think about things. But it's, yeah, which is really helpful to see. Hopefully helpful as well as a member of the community to know what the community looks like. Fantastically varied by the looks of things. That's great. Thanks for taking the time to log in here. So looking at mainly clinicians, or a decent representation, I should say, of clinicians and research and academic staff in the uni, and some third sector and industry as well. Brilliant. Right, I'll carry us on to the next one. So this is really just a kind of Likert score of if this is something that's relevant to your role, if you're in a care or provider organization, is this something that seems usable? Something like this. And please do be honest with this, I should say. Slido's a helpful vehicle for hard feedback sometimes. But we're very keen. That's really the purpose of the next phase of the project, is just to try and tweak this to make sure it is useful. So thank you very much. That's super helpful. And then to give us a sense of how we can kind of move in a better direction as well. You can select many here. I think that's certainly my intention. Apologies if that's not the case. But just of these kind of barriers to using it, what do you think are the most likely? And if you wanted to, I can't see the chat right now, but if you did want to kind of qualify anything, or you're frustrated by my prescriptive multi-choice question, which is very reasonable, then please do drop anything in the chat. That'd be really interesting for me to see, really helpful. But that, yeah, this resonates with some of the messages we've heard about making sure it's respected. So some of the things we're doing are trying to get the tool hosted, as we say, on a kind of central website in NHS colours or .gov.uk branding if we can, and also working with some kind of established educators in NHS governance. This is great. Thank you. And this is the last one. Because one of the key things we've thought about along the way here is how transparent provider organizations should be with the public and their patients about their AI activity, but also the level of or how they manage risks that are in place. And what we've often found is it's quite hard just within the provider organization to know what the kind of AI activity is or have a complete oversight over what's going on. So it is a really challenging issue. I think we'd all like to be transparent, but the kind of practical realities of delivering that accurately are really hard. Yeah, so there's a public registry of AI technologies where they're in use coming up as a popular one. And yeah, perhaps incorporating into regulators' activities as well, like we do with other things and other types of good practice. Right, that's brilliant. I really appreciate that. I know that's not necessarily always part of the brief, but it really will influence the direction we take. So thank you, and hopefully interesting for you to see too. I'll stop rambling if that's about the right time, Joe. Thank you very much. Yeah, and look forward to any questions.
Thanks, Jeff. Brilliant as always. And thanks everyone for taking part in the polling and for your questions I've already seen. So if you do have any questions for Jeff or any points you'd like to clarify or anything at all, frankly, feel free to pop that in the chat. I can see we have a few early questions that come in already. So first one, Jeff, could you talk more about quality assurance and how can it be improved? I think that's in relation to AI and maybe how this framework helps. So yeah, quality assurance of AI.
Yeah, so when I had quality assurance on my slide, what I meant was that whoever's kind of curating these good practices has spent some time looking at what's out there, what overlaps, and the ones that are kind of being spotlighted, if you like, or added to the smorgasbord of controls you may choose to put in place, has spent a bit of time thinking about it. It's an area they're familiar with, and they're to some degree accountable or need to be transparent about why they've chosen some over the others. I suspect the flavor of the question may be more towards quality assurance of the technologies themselves rather than the controls, which is a really good question and particularly challenging in the sort of in-house development context, because even if, so for medical device regulation, there's a very significant gap, as you and others on the call know, between class 1 devices and class 2 devices. But just briefly to talk about that, which side of that line you land has to do with the kind of risk that you bring, which is come to over how critical the care situation it's applied in is, and also the degree of autonomy, if you like, or input into that process that the digital health product has. So if the product and its intended use, crucially, not just the technology, lands on the class 2 side of that, then there's a really big burden of needing to get an approved body to check that you're doing everything properly from a quality assurance point of view. And generally, that just makes it impossible as an NHS provider organisation to do that. There's a few instances where some provider organisations think about that class 1 space, or if there's non-medical device spaces, because there isn't such a clear line of you have to go this way and spend £1 million doing that. Nevertheless, it's still necessary to have a quality management system in place and do all that quality assurance stuff. And it's the kind of thing that in industry, has a lot of investment behind it and people with a very focused expertise. But in a provider organisation, in the NHS or elsewhere, there's enormously talented individuals, but they haven't had to operate in that space before, and they find themselves trying to do that and tick all these boxes to do it responsibly, which is really difficult. And one of the solutions to this is, in larger organizations, having those kind of AI oversight groups that know the detail of medical device regulation, they know the pain of that journey, and they can tell you early before you spend 6 months of your life and how much of the organization's resources, whether it's a good idea or not. The other thing is that external connections, because there are some trusts that have got some good success stories around this, and there's a lot of opportunity for shared learning across the ecosystem. And for the most part, people are extremely willing to do it. But it's often through personal connections or fora like this that happens, rather than people sort of putting their details up somewhere for everybody to see. So yeah, hopefully that speaks to the question.
Thanks, Jeff. And I guess echoing that last point, thinking at a trust level, it's clear to see how you might have resources, infrastructure, and people who have expertise to address all these points. But the point of readiness checklist as well is to help level up those organisations that maybe are only single providers or very small networks, where you not only do not have the expertise, but you won't have it and you can't incorporate that. So how do you encourage those organisations to think in the same way?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And in primary care, for instance, there are other kind of aggregations of organizations where it might be better to have some of this input. But the other thing that we signpost is there are often third-party providers of many of these services. So, for instance, DCB services, which is a legally required clinical safety standard. There are regulatory consultants out there that could tell you relatively quickly. Obviously, there are some incentives at play there as well, but they can give you a very informed idea of what's required and what not for different products. So there are solutions for smaller organization types as well, but you're right to point out that it's really different depending on what the setting is, and that's why we're really keen to enable that kind of generalizability and not being too tightly prescribed.
Super. Thanks, Jeff. We've got a load of questions in the chat, and keep those coming, but I can see we've got a hand up as well. So Kevin, can I hand over to you to ask your question?
Yeah, great presentation, very interesting. I'm coming from the, I suppose, SME provider to the NHS side, and a lot of the factors that you've discussed there are what I would characterize as cultural or infrastructural. The problem is, in the current context of a new 10-year plan, change, an organization that is notoriously resistant to change, how feasible do you think the framework you're suggesting how feasible do you think it's going to be that it gets adopted and used?
Yeah, well, I think it's a significant challenge. We have to be careful not to underestimate, definitely. And that's why we've made space for engaging with various stakeholders and thinking about how we can get it ingrained in kind of central systems already around digital maturity assessment or CQC or central partners. But it's not going to be something that's enforced, that's for sure. And it's not going to be the first publication of this is a good way to do it. That's for sure too. But we hope that by highlighting that these are real risks that organizations own, that there will be an incentive to adopt some of the solutions that are mentioned there. And what we're not aiming for is that AI is adopted everywhere. That's the AI readiness concept isn't necessarily related to how much an organization is using AI. What we're trying to do is make sure that the organizations are equipped to make the right decisions for them, so that they really thought about the costs and benefits of those decisions and are able to compare that on a level playing field to hiring another person as an innovation, if that makes sense. But yes, I'm very mindful of the challenges around that, and we've taken some steps to try and address it, and we'll continue to do, but it's a real risk.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I was going to say the response is typically to kick the can down the road and not make a decision.
Great, thank you. Thanks, both. So I think this question could be multi-pronged, really. Samara asks, how do you incorporate patient input, in particular potential diagnostic and therapeutic applications of AI? So I read that in two ways. First of all, how do we include patient input in the AI readiness project product itself, the developments in co-production, but also maybe in how should trusts consider patient input when they're making decisions around readiness. Yeah, 2 levels.
Yeah, so we're working towards some PPIE activity in the coming weeks to get under the skin of this a little bit. I think for me, one of the key questions is that transparency piece. It's really helpful for you guys to contribute to that in the Slido poll to get the kind of professional side of that. But I think it'll be interesting to see, because there's already precedent for instance, DSPT, the Data Security Protection Toolkit. There's a list you could look at right now online of all the trusts that meet that standard or not, and it's actually a legal requirement. And there are trusts that don't, and that's public, which is interesting, particularly as it feels like a bit of an advert for cyber criminals. And I'll be interested to see how important transparency around that is, and how much of an enabler that is, if that changes public perception around AI, or how it's seen as beneficial or not. And then in terms of integrating it into governance processes, that's something we've heard some examples of, and in the controls part of it, will include some bits there as well. So there are examples of leaflets and other materials like posters that improve the visibility of the fact that AI is present in a service. And that's actually a requirement because the use of AI depends on implicit consent, usually rather than explicit consent, but implicit consent's only valid if it's actually obvious that it's being used, if that makes sense. There's also, we've seen examples of it being baked into either processes. So when we're talking about what happens in the implementation journey of who the different stakeholders are, there's a process where it's pitched at a patient or public involvement group at some point. Others actually have representatives on a governance group or project group. So there are a range of different examples of how to do it, but I think it is important.
Thanks, Jeff. Question now from Fleur Samuel Gonzalez. So around how healthcare systems can build sustainable AI capacity, not just pilotitis. What are the effective ways to ensure long-term AI readiness?
Yeah. Well, there's a range of different answers to that question. It's a really good point, but I think it requires conscious investment, basically, in expertise and workforce. And what we're trying to do by laying that out as a kind of menu of controls, some of which are, have an AI oversight group, fund task and finish groups around specific projects, have a workforce champion so that somebody in the routine workforce is actually like a product owner and is sustained to be. I think a lot of people going into this don't think about that. And the reason that sustainability isn't there after that, I can think of several projects that implemented and they've been in a few years, and we kind of see, so how, what's the latest audit shown, and it's kind of just crept into routine use and people aren't thinking about it that much. It's because it wasn't part of the initial business case necessarily, but didn't realize how much of a necessity it was to ensure continued safe, effective performance. So we're hoping to make that clearer. And it comes back to this idea of AI readiness being around making the decision based on accurate information, of knowing the true costs and benefits of committing to this innovation. So I think it's important that we move as a system in that direction. And I hope this contributes to that just through really raising its visibility and understanding across decision makers.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm aware of time, so I'm gonna smush a few questions that are all kind of similar to each other into one slightly more complicated and maybe incompatible question. But anyway, here we go. Here's a try. Where does the readiness checklist fit in with existing frameworks, particularly the digital maturity assessment? I know you touched on that in your talk, but maybe if we made that a bit more explicit. And kind of in relation to that, how do we guard against this becoming tick boxy and performative and a yes no rather than a kind of what's the word, introspective exercise? Yeah, thoughts on those two?
Yeah, so I think those are well smushed because they're definitely relevant to one another. I see the distinction between digital maturity assessment and AI readiness checklist, being a bit that there's more of a concrete and objective shared sense of what good looks like. I mean, that's the name of the document for the digital maturity assessment, and that it feels more okay to say you're a 4.5, you're a 5.6, and that number feels like it means something, because I guess it's more established and agreed upon. And it may be a kind of aspirational state for this, or a future state, that we become so clear that certain controls are just a must-have that you need to have in every organization, that it becomes an extension of the digital maturity assessment, and it's no longer required. But I think in the current state, there isn't that degree of certainty, and there is a need for flexibility and also action now. And so I feel like what this offers is practical guidance to experienced clinical and digital leaders who really know their context and know the field, if not these specific technologies, really just to equip them to apply their own expertise to the decisions that they're having to make right now. And I think that there may be a convergence between these two things over time. And I think we certainly help the uptake of it, but hopefully this is a helpful step in that direction.
Thanks, Jeff. A bit more smushing coming up now. Questions more on current and future scope. Can this tool be used for departments within hospitals, or is it kind of, is it more aimed at kind of institutional or kind of organizational level assessments? And then I guess related to that, is it to be used for individual AI tools or for general groups of tools? So like, is it for a specific product or is it for AVTs in general? And then a question about future scope around, yes, this has clear applications to health, but what about outside of health, but health adjacent stuff like social care or local government? Yeah, questions on scope.
Cool. I'll go backwards through those. So we are exploring that scope of organization type. So we connected to social care and social work leaders in England and in Northern Ireland in the early stage of conversations there. And what we hear is that there's a need, the need is the same. I think the kind of current status of those sectors and provider types is different, in that it might feel even newer in some than others. And I think there are some areas where particularly the language is problematic, like talking about patients rather than service users, for instance, between care and healthcare. But if we can, what we're pursuing basically, is there a way that we're at an appropriate level of abstraction and use the right language that actually does apply to both settings, that it does provide value? And if not, that we don't try and overstretch it and just kind of support parallel work if that's helpful. So we're in an explorative phase, scope wider than we thought initially. I think for sure that's what we heard from the workshop. And we want to be as valuable as we can, whilst not just saying we are and not actually delivering on it. Then I can remember the department one. I might need a reminder on the middle one in a bit. So can it be used by a department? I think that really it certainly targets an organization as a unit, if you like. And I would encourage any department that has AI expertise to use this as a tool to lobby their organization to create a centralized structure if there is not one already, because it's just such a pity for the organization to have those expertise in one part of it, but it's not benefiting the rest of an organization. So I think there are kind of secondary users of this tool who can lobby other parts of their organization or make business cases to other parts of their organization to sort of say, hey, there is consensus that this is good practice, and it would serve our organization through X, Y, and Z. So I hope I can see kind of second users, but I would definitely encourage, and the tool would encourage, a kind of single oversight structure for an organization. And sorry, Joe, can you remind me of the middle one?
Yeah, it was on the, is it for an individual product or is it for groups products?
Thank you. So risk management generally is a really specific exercise, thinking about the detail of what could go wrong and why. And that translates to this. So it is a specific AI product that you should be thinking about, and a specific way of using it in your organization. And the kind of high level potential causes of harm and ways of controlling them are for you to fill the detail in with your expertise of the setting, because otherwise there is a risk that it just becomes a bit too abstract and not very actionable.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to call us to order there, because we have loads more questions in the chat, but we won't possibly have time to cover them all. So just want to take the opportunity to thank you again for joining us today and for presenting. There are lots of comments that are brilliant in the chat and lots of questions for Jeff. If Jeff, would you mind dropping your email in the chat, just in case anyone does want to keep the conversation going? I
Thank
think
you
Jeff
very
and
much.
team would.
I'll do that.
No, it's all right. Jeff and team would really appreciate comments, feedback, and thoughts on the prototype. I'm going to round off by handing back to Emma, who'll tell us a bit more about next meetings and then send us all off into lunch. Emma, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. And I just want to say thanks again to Jeff. That was so interesting. And I think lots of people had loads of great questions. So really, really great for everybody. So yeah, just a last thing is our just to highlight our next meeting. The date has changed. So it was originally the 9th of December. So it's now moved forward a week to the 2nd of December. And we're having a panel of the clinical AI fellows who are coming to talk to us about. So it's ones that have been on the fellowship, and they're going to talk about their experiences, and particularly we want them to talk about their future directions, like how it's helped their career, what's their career track like now. So that should be really interesting. I do understand that this round of clinical AI fellowship applications is now open, so we're kind of advertising that and saying apply, really. And then this month we've got on AI for Women's Health meeting on the 26th of November, where we've got Professor Jane Hurst, who's coming to talk about AI and digital solutions to close this last mile care gaps for women in low and middle income countries. And then we've got George Partridge coming to talk about attending a conference. So it's like a roundup of this conference that he's going to, the main takeaways from the WHIS. I don't actually know what that stands for, but I assume it's like Women's Health International Symposium, I think is what it stands for. It's coming up anyway. I'm sure it'll be really interesting. So you do have to register for that one separately. So I'll probably share that again on LinkedIn so people can see that. So thanks a lot, everybody. And I'll get the video up really quickly, because I'm sure lots of more people will be interested, and see you hopefully on the 2nd of December. Bye-bye.